All right, welcome to part two, the substantive portion of this week's lecture. So let's talk about administrative law. But before we jump in, I want you to think about the role of government. What is the proper role of government? The Constitution gives us at least part of the answer, which is to promote and protect the public health and welfare. Now, how you as an individual think government should carry out its role is a political opinion. The beauty of administrative law is that the rules apply regardless of political opinion, political ideology. This is an area where people of all political persuasions can agree on the importance of rules, the idea of accountability, and the need for public participation in our government. The Trump administration has been a very different administration in terms of administrative law, unlike any prior administration, Republican or Democratic. We're going to touch on this different approach throughout the semester, but really I'm going to focus on teaching the concepts of administrative law and how the executive branch is supposed to operate. So what is administrative law? The basic definition is that it's the law that governs how executive branch agencies function. And upon reading that definition, a lot of people think, doesn't matter to me, I'm not impacted by administrative law. But they're wrong. It is actually the foundation of a lot of modern life in America. You are, in fact, surrounded by administrative law. That's why I've got these pictures from the Matrix. You don't necessarily know it's there, but it's there, and it's touching you every day in so many different ways. So our government, or actually governments, plural, because we've got federal, state, and local governments, use administrative law to regulate everything from banking, where your bank accounts are insured by the FDIC, to transportation, where the Federal Highway Administration has a lot to say, to medicine, where your doctor or your lawyer needs a license to practice their profession, to education, where schools have to comply with federal and state laws and regulations, all the way down to the food that you eat. So there was a study by Colorado State University many years ago, and that study identified 41,000 regulations that apply to eating a hamburger. These regulations govern everything from the grazing of beef cattle all the way down to the assembly of the burger at your local fast food restaurant. So that's 41,000 regulations just for a hamburger, and that's part of how administrative law impacts your life. Here are some other examples of administrative law in action. The money in your pocket, that's issued by the Federal Reserve. The water you drink is protected by the Environmental Protection Agency. The national and state parks you visit are regulated by the government. The marijuana that you can purchase legally in Colorado is controlled by the State Department of Public Health and the Environment. The Boulder Police or the Denver Police. The police are themselves an administrative agency within the executive branch. And then, of course, you've got air travel, which is regulated by both the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, and the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. And you'll see that I've got the seatbelt sign. If you decide to risk a surreptitious mission to the laboratory when that seatbelt sign is on, do not ask a flight attendant for permission. And that's because the FAA distinguishes between the flight attendant's duty to inform and their duty to enforce. So in general, the FAA emphasizes the types of information that the flight attendants must provide to passengers about federal regulations and when they must provide it. And that's why before the plane takes off, every single time you're on an airplane, they explain to you how to put your seatbelt on. But the FAA is much less prescriptive in describing how diligent flight attendants must be in enforcing regulations. So they don't, for instance, the FAA regs don't require flight attendants to lock the door to the bathroom anytime the seatbelt sign is on. So because of these incongruous expectations, flight attendants have evolved a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy. It would be negligent for a flight attendant to affirmatively grant you permission to use the bathroom if the seatbelt sign is illuminated, but many of them aren't likely to stop you unless they judge the conditions to be truly unsafe. This is not to say to ignore your flight attendants, do exactly what they tell you to do, just you'll have a better chance at using the restroom when that seatbelt sign is on if you don't ask permission. So all of this government regulation, it's not new. It's been around for a long time. I mean, obviously not FAA regulations, those didn't come into effect until we had airplanes. But going back to Egypt under the pharaohs, there was a firm central bureaucracy, and that operated to prevent famine, provide security, provide a justice system to settle disputes, handle public works like building pyramids, and basically to protect the general welfare. The Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire had a strong bureaucratic regime. They had a chief administrator, an economic policy maker, a chief of law enforcement, and treasury agents. And it was Rome that originated the merit system, the paid civil service, and other major features of modern public administration that we still use today. Persia, India, China, they all had strong centralized administrations going back thousands of years. There are even some exhibits in the Smithsonian featuring Chinese administrative art that was created to mark important administrative conferences. So 3,000 years ago, people were handing out conference swag. So administrative law, it is the body of law made by or about agencies. Got a whole bunch of agency logos here up on the screen. Usually, these are executive branch agencies. And administrative law governs the way in which those agencies can function. It defines their powers, their responsibilities, their limitations, and it tells them what procedures they must use to take action. So at the federal level, most agencies sit within the executive branch, and they are controlled by our country's chief executive, the President of the United States. He is the head of the executive branch. There are also independent agencies. They are also situated in the executive branch, but the president has substantially less control over them. And then there are a small handful of agencies within the legislative and judicial branches. So for instance, the Congressional Budget Office and the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And then, of course, there are state and local agencies, including law enforcement, public health, emergency planning, etc. This class is going to focus on the federal government, but in terms of administrative law, the structure is very, very similar at the federal and state levels. So we're going to focus on federal executive branch agencies, particularly the agencies whose actions tend to affect our rights as individuals, or regulate the actions of corporations or other organizations. So, for instance, we won't focus heavily on the State Department. The State Department is an important executive branch agency, but for those of us who are staying put in the US, it doesn't really tend to affect us on a daily basis. It's impacting me right now because of the slowdown in getting passports renewed, but typically we're going to focus on the agencies that really do reach into our daily lives. Be aware that there are different names for agencies. So departments, commissions, offices, bureaus, councils, divisions, these are all different names for agencies. All right, so how do we get agencies? Why do we even need them? So most agencies are created by Congress. Congress passes a statute. It's known as the implementing or enabling legislation. And while Congress creates the agencies, it then places most of them in the executive branch, where they are accountable to the president. Most of the federal agencies that we think about, FBI for instance, they are constituent parts of larger cabinet level agencies. And these cabinet level agencies are headed by individuals, usually called secretaries, who are members of the president's cabinet. So for instance, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Commerce. Now, not every single agency head is called a secretary. The Department of Justice, for example, is headed by the Attorney General, not the Secretary of Justice. So we need agencies Because generally speaking, we actually expect quite a lot from our government. Even the most politically conservative opponents of big government expect police, fire, and other emergency services. They want protections for our bank accounts, food that's safe to consume, and other benefits that government agencies provide. Now, the biggest need for agencies actually comes from Congress. And that's because members of Congress they can't be experts in all subjects. Um, Congress touches almost every subject that you can imagine, and you can't expect a single congressperson to know about, the best way to get to Mars, and also safe methods of drilling for oil, and also the amount of lead that could possibly be, remaining in old buildings. So Congress relies on agencies to provide special expertise and technical knowledge. Additionally, we need agencies because they are more nimble than Congress. It's easier to implement regulations than to pass statutes. So our agencies can adapt more quickly to changing circumstances, or at least they are supposed to. And you'll see this in A Fighting Chance. Elizabeth Warren talks about the ability of agencies to move quickly, which is especially important to protect the public health and welfare. So for instance, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, it can issue a recall immediately if a crib or car seat is dangerous. The CDC is supposed to be able to move quickly to study emerging diseases. It would take Congress a very long time to pass a law to protect the public, but agencies can regulate quickly. Again, things are a little bit different right now because we find ourselves in a fairly unique time and place for administrative law, but overall, Congress deals with statutes, which take more time. Agencies move quickly with regulations. Now, one thing that we have to think about is whether agencies are better suited for decision making, and I mean better suited than Congress. Just because we need agencies, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want them making all of our decisions. We elect our members of Congress. We do not elect agency officials or personnel. Additionally, agencies are continuously involved in the same policy areas, and that means they have ongoing relationships with non-governmental organizations, and they're always exposed to the same issues, problems, and organizations or people, including lobbyists. Is that good? Is it bad? It's really a little bit of both. And it depends on the type of agency, the topic, the public interest, and the political willpower to get things done. Now, there are three types of executive branch agencies that we can split up by function. First, you've got your social welfare agencies, and these are tasked with promoting the general health and welfare by providing direct services and benefits to members of the public. The CDC and Veterans Affairs are two such social welfare agencies. Second, you've got the regulatory and investigatory agencies, and these agencies are tasked with promoting or prohibiting certain behaviors and business practices. And these agencies enforce the law through the permitting process, but also through prosecution, which could be administrative prosecution, or they could turn it over to the Department of Justice for prosecution, criminal or civil. So examples at the federal level, you've got the FCC, OSHA, the EPA, and the FBI. Those are your regulatory and investigatory agencies. And third and finally, we have public service agencies. For instance, the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, NIH and NSF. These agencies provide special services. They are usually related to research. And so they provide federal funds, give it to researchers, often at universities and nonprofits, in order to eventually better the public health and welfare. So there are a number of sources of administrative law, all of which are going to be important throughout this class. And those include constitutions, again, plural, because we have the US Constitution, plus every state has its own constitution. I've got statutes, regulations, which are also called rules, court decisions, which make up what we refer to as the common law, and executive orders. And pretty much any type of agency action is going to be based on one of those sources of law. And that's because there must be authority in one form or another in order for the agency to do its business lawfully. So in the broadest scheme, our system of laws flows from constitutional sources. The U.S. Constitution for the federal government and state constitutions for the various states. It is the essential feature of our system of government that powers are derived from constitutional sources and that they are separated into three main branches of government, and that would be the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. So the U.S. Constitution establishes our legislative branch, Congress, in Article 1. It establishes the executive branch, headed by the President, in Article 2. And it establishes the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, in Article 3. And the Constitution grants specific authority to each of these three co-equal branches of the federal government. And it creates what we typically refer to as separation of powers between the branches, or checks and balances. So the legislative branch creates the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch reviews and interprets the law to make sure that it is in line with the Constitution. Now, the Constitution says absolutely nothing about agencies, but all aspects of government have to be governed by the law. And agencies have to possess authority based on these types of laws, like I said, in order to lawfully conduct their business. Two sources of authority are going to be very important to understand for this class, and that would be the statute and the regulation, again, also called a rule. Both of these are grants of authority, but they are developed into distinctly different ways. So statutes, we tend to think, of all types of the law as statutes passed by Congress or a state legislature, and that is true. So Congress passes a law saying we're not allowed to, pass counterfeit currency, and that's why we don't use our fancy printers to print our own $20 bills. Or if we do, we run the risk of being caught and prosecuted. But Congress can also use statutes to delegate some of its lawmaking authority to agencies. So that might surprise you, but agencies have lawmaking authority. So for example, Congress tells the FAA to regulate air travel, and so the FAA promulgates regulations, and those have the force of law, and that's why you have to follow orders that are given to you by a flight attendant. And if you don't, and you're creating a danger to yourself or others, then federal agents will meet you when the plane lands. So on the screen is another example of a statute. It doesn't have anything to do with our class, but it's a fairly simple one. This is from Title 15 of the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is the compilation of federal statutes, federal laws passed by Congress. So here, Congress has authorized the Federal Trade Commission to create rules prohibiting deceptive or abusive telemarketing practices. And in this case, prescribe rules means promulgate regulations, so create and issue regulations. So this is a direct grant of authority from Congress to the FTC. And then the FTC and other agencies, they carry out this authority in two primary ways: adjudications and rulemaking. Adjudications are kind of like a mini version of a court trial, and we will cover those later in the semester. Rulemaking is like a mini legislative session, and it produces regulations, and regulations happen to look a lot like statutes. So on the screen is an example of the FTC regulation that defines and prohibits certain abusive telemarketing practices. So at first glance, it doesn't look all that different from the previous screen. But you could see this is from Title 16 of the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations, not the U.S. Code. So the U.S. Code is a compilation of statutes passed by Congress, and the CFR is a compilation of regulations issued by agencies. So by issuing this regulation that you see on the screen, the FTC used the authority granted to it by Congress to carry out the will of Congress, or at least the will of Congress as the FTC understood it. So think of it this way. Statutes create a broad legal framework, and then agencies fill in the details with regulations. But both statutes and regulations do have the force of law. Executive orders also grant or restrict agency authority. On the screen, we've got an example of an executive order. So EOs, executive orders, are one of the ways that the president or the governor can order around the executive branch, the various administrative agencies that report up to the chief executive. So the particular executive order on the screen was issued by FDR in June of 1941. And it requires fair employment practices in the defense industries. It required the Department of Defense and defense contractors to adhere to principles of non-discrimination on the basis of race, religion, color, or national origin. Now, there are limits to executive orders. A president cannot overturn a law via an executive order because of separation of powers. Congress is responsible for passing laws. A president can't even overturn a regulation via executive order. Even though regulations are issued by the executive branch, which reports to the president, there is a law that we will discuss called the Administrative Procedure Act, and it has certain procedures that have to happen when agencies issue but also repeal regulations. So when our government began, as soon as we broke away from England, the federal government was a lot weaker than it is today. So we don't often think about it except for briefly in history class, but before the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation. And those articles specifically created a weak national government and strong state governments. However, that did not work well in practice. Our founders realized that we needed a stronger federal government. And so when they drafted the Constitution, they included the Commerce Clause. And that has been a major source of Congress's lawmaking authority throughout American history, most especially since the New Deal. And we are going to talk in depth about the Commerce Clause next week. And again, I promise that it's going to be more interesting than maybe Commerce Clause sounds. So for the first 70-ish years of our history, the U.S. operated with only 4 government agencies. We had the Department of War, Department of State, Department of Navy, and Department of Treasury, plus the Office of Attorney General. But as more territories gained statehood, as the nation's population grew and we expanded west to become a very large country, people's demand for more services and more protections from the government grew as well. So the Great Depression, the World Wars, New Deal, all of these gave rise to many agencies that helped to revive the economy and also to handle new social issues. So after the Great Depression, Roosevelt's New Deal relied heavily on the Commerce Clause to revive the economy. And the New Deal created many of the federal agencies that we know today and that we kind of just take for granted that they've always been there. They haven't. They're relatively recent. So the emergence of a national marketplace and then a global marketplace, that also led to the growth of the federal government. And as people became more interdependent on each other, not just nationally, but globally, we became interdependent on each other for food, for healthcare, for technology, and other aspects of life throughout the 20th and now 21st centuries. The bureaucratic infrastructure, it expanded to provide us with assurances of safety, privacy, and quality of goods and services. So there was this expansion of government under Roosevelt that created the bureaucracy that we have today. Then after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, we saw another rapid growth in the federal bureaucracy. So just days after the terrorist attacks, Republican President George W. Bush appointed the very first director of the Office of Homeland Security. And that office was placed in the White House, and its intent was to oversee and coordinate a comprehensive national strategy to safeguard us against terrorism, to respond to any future attacks. So we had a Republican president create that, and then Congress, which went back and forth between Democratic and Republican control, the 107th Congress passed the Homeland Security Act, which officially created the Department of Homeland Security. So the Office of Homeland Security in the White House moved out, and it became its own cabinet-level department, and Congress combined 22 different federal agencies into this single, unified, cabinet-level Department of Homeland Security. So again, we can see here that the federal bureaucracy, it is not intended to be partisan. And the civil service, when Pew or any of the other organizations, when they do surveys of the civil service, the civil service pretty much comes down in the middle. It is split fairly equally between Democrats and Republicans, and plus it's got a smattering of independents. So we tend to think of, conservatives advocate for smaller government, but Republican presidents have expanded the federal bureaucracy when they have deemed it necessary. And that could be President Nixon creating the EPA to address environmental contamination, or again, President Bush with the Department of Homeland Security to make sure that we had better agency cooperation. So again, for most Americans, regardless of our political affiliation, we expect a lot from the government. We want the government to protect our privacy. We don't want our social security numbers just out there. Most of them are anyway because of hacks, but the government tries to protect them. We want to visit national parks. We want to drive on highways and bridges that don't collapse. We want effective regulation of markets so that businesses get to compete on an even playing field. So we do really expect a lot from our government. And our government today is made up of 15 cabinet-level departments, plus a number of agencies that have the same status as a cabinet department, but aren't actually part of the cabinet. That would be, for instance, the EPA and NASA. So our federal government employs around 4 million people directly. So these are people who get their paychecks from the U.S. Treasury. And that includes 2.8 million civilians and 1.4 million military personnel in the executive branch. We also have millions of indirect employees, possibly around 14 million, although nobody knows for sure, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit later in the semester. These indirect employees include government contractors and grantees. If you think of, say, Lockheed Martin, yes, it makes planes, that the airlines purchase for civilian flights, but it also does a ton of government work for defense and aerospace. We've got quasi-official agencies like the Smithsonian or Amtrak, that's the train service. We've got quasi-governmental agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that oversee mortgages. And then we've got government-sponsored organizations like the Jet Propulsion Lab, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and so forth. So this is a list of our 15 cabinet-level departments. All of those contain numerous agencies. And then I've got a very, very incomplete list of our independent agencies. So keep this list in mind when you start thinking about a topic for your policy analysis memo due at the end of the semester, because you might decide to address that memo to one of these agencies. All right, well, congratulations. You have made it to the end of your first administrative law lecture. Nothing is due this week. I am going to open up the D1 discussion board. Your post's not due until week 2, but please do feel free to get started now. Next week, we're going to begin our discussion of the federal bureaucracy. Hope you guys have a good week, and I will see you on the discussion boards.